So now it's time to actually build the application, this URL shortening application. But before we write any code, we're going to look at the database schema, and we're also going to talk about the directory structure and file structure of this as well. So for the database, we're going to need to build up a schema for this to store links. So I'm using a database called website at the moment, but obviously depending on your application, this might be different, or you might just choose to call it something different. Let's do a show tables command, and you can see that we've got no tables at all. So let's build up this database table that's going to store our links for us. So we issue the create table command, and we will choose, well, we've got 4 fields here. So it's ID, URL, code, and created. So the ID is just going to be the auto-incrementing ID. This is extremely important because we're going to be using this to base convert this number to give us our unique code that's going to identify the shortened URL. So this is going to be an integer. It's going to be not null, and it's also going to be the primary key of this table. And we also want this to be an auto increment. That's extremely important. For every record that we create, we want this to increment up, and this will start at 1. So the URL is going to be a varchar, and that's going to be 255 characters. And the code is also going to be a varchar. That's just a variable character, and that's going to be 12. Now the created at will be a date time field, which will store the value using the now function. So, let's just change this because we didn't supply a table name. So we're going to call this links. And there we go. So let's now issue the show tables command that says now we've got this links table in here, and let's describe this table just to make sure we've got everything set up as we want. So we've got our ID, URL, code created, and it looks like the types are all fine, and we've also got the primary key and the auto increment in there. So now what we can actually do is talk about our directory structure. We've already built our index.php and global.css files. The style sheet's not important anymore. What's going to happen then is we're going to submit through to this Shortener.php file, which we've got created here, but obviously no code in. That's then going to make use of the Shortener.php class within the class's directory. So that we're going to be building the actual class inside of here that's going to handle making and getting the URL, as well as connecting to our database. So inside of the root directory, we've also got redirect.php, which is going to actually redirect based on a URL that's passed through. And we're also going to be creating an Htaccess file, which will handle that as well. So that will be the part where we have the nice short URL. Now, before we start building any of the Shortener.php class, I'm going to be connecting to my database within this class. And it's obviously important to note that you wouldn't really do this in a real life situation. You'd probably be connecting to your database somewhere else. So we're just going to be doing it inside of here for demonstration purposes, but ideally you would have some kind of database handler class, something like that you would use here. But we'll just do this because it's, the tutorial is about just building this application, and we don't want to waste too much time building something we don't need to. So let's define this Shortener.php class and look at what we need in here. So the class is going to be called Shortener, and inside of here we're going to have a database property which is going to store our database connection. So we'll look at doing this now. So this will be a protected property, and we'll call this DB. So when we instantiate this class, when we go to use this functionality, we're going to have a constructor function which is run when this class is instantiated. If you're not sure what this means, don't worry, we'll look at doing this later with a new keyword. But the job of the construct in this case is to connect to the database. So we'll say for demo purposes, and like I said, you'd probably have some other way to connect to your database. Inside of here, we will say this db equals, and this is going to be a new MySQLi object and connect to our database. So at this point, we're actually connecting to our database via the server that we choose. We provide the username for the MySQL server, the password, and then also the database name. In our case, it's website. So this will now connect to our database. We're not doing any error handling here or anything like that. We're going to ignore that. We're just going to do this for demo purposes. Now we'll go ahead and outline the functions that we need in here. The first one is going to be make, and this is the job of this, or we can call it something like make code. The job of this is basically going to be to actually pass in a URL and return the code that's been generated, and also store this as well. Now we're also going to have get URL, so we have public function get URL, and this is going to have a code passed into it. In actual fact, this is going to have a URL passed into it as well, so we may as well define that now. So get URL is going to have a code passed into it, and that's going to return the URL that we need to redirect to. Now we're also going to have a private or protected function, whichever makes sense if you're going to extend this class. Protected function called generate code, and the job of this is going to be to actually generate a code based on a number, and that number will be the auto increment ID within our database table. So that's how our class is going to look. Let's though focus on submitting this form and passing the content through to Shortener.php to make use of this functionality that we haven't quite built yet, and this will sort of demonstrate the workflow that we're going to be using. So inside of here, we're actually going to be setting a session later on to redirect and show a message on the index page. So we need to use session start to allow sessions to be used. So we initialize that. And because we have our shortener class, we need to require this in to be able to make use of its functionality. So this is in classes/shortener.php. And we can instantiate this and test that everything works actually. So we can say S is a new shortener. So once we run this line, what's actually going to happen is we're actually going to run this block of code here and connect to our database, and then we'll have DB as our MySQLi instance. So in this case, we can use our database functionality throughout our shortener class. So we need to check here that a URL has been passed through to this file from our form. So we use isSet and we check post URL. And then inside of here, we can go ahead and store that in a variable just so it's easier to use, like so. So let's echo this out just so we can test that this works. So what we should see now is we shouldn't see any errors through connecting to here, and from our form we should then go through to here and we should see the URL that we submitted output. So let's enter a URL in here and hit shorten, and there we are, we can see that. So we know that's working, we're not seeing any errors from this, so we can assume that we've connected to our database. So instead of doing this, what we want to do is we actually want to make use of our make code method, which remember we haven't built yet. So I'm going to say if code equals, we're assigning at the same time checking that a Boolean value returned from the make code method is true. So we use make code and pass in URL. We can echo out the code, and that's it. So otherwise there was a problem, but we'll deal with that later. So what's happening here is we are calling the make code method that we defined here. This is going to return a code, remember. It's not actually going to return a variable, a Boolean. It's going to return an empty string or a string with contents in. And if it returns an empty string, then we'll assume there was a problem. Otherwise, there'll be a code here, which is, a valid code. It's not an empty string. So let's focus now on building this make code function or method. So what we need to do here is, first of all, well, we don't need to do this, but I'm going to trim the URL that was passed through. And what I want to do is check that this was a valid URL. Remember, we're doing front-end validation, but this means that people can change the type of field that we're working with, and they can bypass that validation, particularly if the browser doesn't support front-end validation via the HTML5 URL input type. So we're going to use the filter var function, passing in the URL, and we're going to filter this, making sure it's a valid URL. So if that's falsy, then we are going to return false from this function. Or we can just return an empty string. That would keep more consistent with the fact we're returning a string at the end of this anyway. So this will return, this will validate as false in an if statement. So what we now want to do is, once that is out of the way and we haven't returned at this point, we can escape the URL. We're going to do this first of all before we start using it in queries, because obviously we have the potential for SQL injection if we don't escape. So we can access this DB that we've already seen up here. We've already set that to the MySQL instance, and we can use the escape string method or the real escape string method. They do exactly the same thing. This is just an alias of real escape string, and we pass in the URL. So let's echo out the URL just to make return the URL just to make sure everything's okay. We're not actually going to end up doing this, but in this case it should just echo out the URL. So just purely for testing, this works. So I'm going to hit shorten. There we are. So we know that everything works now. Okay, so instead of returning the URL, we want to first of all check if URL already exists. So that's what we're doing here, and we need to issue a query, but we're going to store this inside of a variable called exists. So we say this db query, and the query will be selecting the code from the links table, and that is where the URL is equal to the URL that we've already escaped and passed through. So if the URL does already exist, then we can just return the code. So return code. Otherwise, we need to generate and store URL and code. So we'll do this in a moment. So how do we check if this actually exists? Well, this presumably will return a positive integer. It should always be 1 because we're never storing more than one of the same URL. So in this case, we can say if exists num rows, and if that's the case, we obviously just want to return the code. So from the function, or from the method, we return exists, which is this up here, fetch object. This will return us with the first result code, so we're returning the code. So let's check that this actually works by inserting a record. At the moment, nothing's going to happen because when we type in a URL here and click shorten, this doesn't exist, so we're not returning anything from this method. But let's insert a record just to test this. So I'm going to insert into links, and I want to provide a URL, a code, and a created value. So the values for these are going to be google.co.uk. The code will just put as goog123 or something, and the created at value will be the now function. So now when we select everything from the links table, you can see that we've got a URL and a code. So what should happen now is when I go ahead and enter www.google.co.uk here, we should be returned with the code, which we are. So that's in the case that a user enters a URL that already exists. Therefore, we don't need to actually generate or insert anything into the database or generate any codes. Otherwise, let's get a little bit more specific. What do we need to do? We need to insert a record without a code. The reason we do this is we insert a record, and then from the ID, the inserted ID, we then generate the code. Then we go back and we update the record with the code. So let's do this now. We'll just capitalize this I to keep all our comments consistent. We'll say, and we'll also pull this down, insert is, and this is going to be another query, so db query. We are inserting into the links table, and we are inserting a URL and a created value. Then the values for this are going to be a URL, we know this, it's just URL, and created at, which is going to be the now function. So once that's created, we haven't actually stored a code alongside of it. So when we look inside of our database, we haven't actually run this, but we'll have a URL and code will be null. So now we want to generate a code. So generate code based on inserted ID. So we're going to create, or we already have defined up here, another method for this. So the code is going to be this generate code, and that will be based on the insert ID. So the number that we're passing through to this method, which we discussed earlier, is going to be this DB, not this insert. Remember, the insert ID property is available from the actual database object itself. So that's the last inserted ID. Then we go ahead and update the record with the generated code. And the only problem is we haven't actually generated a code yet because the functionality in here doesn't exist. So let's do that now. This is extremely simple. It's just returning what's returned from the base convert method or function in PHP. Now this will obviously just change the base. So we have a number. In this case, if it's 1, we want to convert from base 10 to base 36. Now, what's going to happen here is if the ID of the record is 1, converting that to base 36 is just 1. So we might consider setting the auto increment at an extremely high value initially. So we can do that by saying alter table links, and we're setting the auto increment to, and I'll just choose 100 million. Now, I'm not saying this is the best idea. There are probably better ways to actually generate unique codes. But in this case, we always know that the value is going to be unique because it's just changing the base of a unique auto-incrementing number. So although if you don't set your auto-increment value in your database to something like 100 million, you'll get stuff like 1, 2, 3, 4 coming back as your unique URL, which really, if you think about it, is still a short URL. So it shouldn't be a problem. So we've generated the code. We can now go ahead and update the record that we just created with this new code. So let's perform the update query now. And we'll say this db. And in fact, we don't actually need to store this in a variable there. We'll get rid of that. So we say this db query. So the query this time is updating the links table, setting the code equal to the code that we've just generated, so we can plonk that in there. And this is where the ID is the, oops, let's just get rid of that single quote there, put it back there. So we're updating where the ID is the last inserted ID, or we can update where the URL is the URL. So we'll go with that option because it's easier. We've already escaped this value. Not that we'd need to escape an insert ID, but anyway, this is how we'd end up having it look. So we're updating the code value where the URL is the same as the URL we've just generated. So now what we can do is inside of here, return the code. So that's pretty much it. We'll get a code back for a newly inserted record now. So if we select everything from links, you'll notice that we only have 1 in here. Let's go and generate a new one. So we'll choose google.com this time, click shorten, and that's the unique code. We'll be forwarding the user back to the index page in a moment, but let's take a look inside of our database, and we can see here we've got an ID of 100 million, the URL is google.com, and the code is this. Let's also check that this works in the same way as we saw before. So google.com should return the same ID, and that hasn't inserted another record, it's just returned the same code. Perfect. So now onto the Shortener.php file again. Let's head back over to that. So instead of echoing the code, that isn't useful. I'm going to set a session value here with feedback, and this is going to be generated or generated, and I'll say your short URL is, and we need to output a URL here. So in this case, I'll just say an anchor, The short URL is going to be the same as the path we're currently working in. So if I just copy this and paste that into both here and into here, let's just do a little bit of escaping because we've got some double quotes here. So let's escape this. Let's escape this. Now after this, we want to insert the actual code that's been generated. We know that we have that. It's here. So we can insert that to there, and we can insert that here as well. So let's just make sure this is all okay. Perfect. So if not, we've got a problem. So either the, the only problem really we've got at the moment is if the URL isn't valid, or if a value hasn't been supplied, that also equals an invalid URL. So we're sort of doing two validation pieces at once. So I'll just say there was a problem, invalid URL perhaps. So let's test this out just to make sure we haven't done anything wrong. So let's enter. Okay, cool. So that looks like there were no errors. So let's make this a little bit more useful. The reason that we're storing this in a session is because inside of index.php, we're going to make use of these sessions to output this to the user and then remove the session. A sort of placeholder of just telling the user what's happened. So I'm going to start sessions up here because down here, I'm going to want to check if these sessions actually exist. So here, I'm going to create an if statement and use isSet to check if this feedback session exists. Now, if it does exist down here, I want to actually unset this. So the next time the user refreshes the page, we don't see the same feedback, or visits another page and comes back. That would be a little bit annoying. But before we unset the session, we want to output a paragraph, and this is going to be basically what's in session. So session feedback, and that's it. So let's test this out as we did before, but we didn't get any feedback. Well, you can see that the session now has been brought to us, but let's do this from the beginning. So let's enter a URL that does exist, so google.com, and oh, of course, right. So if we just go back over to Shortener.php, we're not actually redirecting anywhere, which isn't useful at all. So down here, what we're going to do is redirect back to the index page, just using the header function. So now what's going to happen is when we enter a URL that already exists, we click shorten, that session that we created is now going to go through here. When we refresh, that will go. So now we enter perhaps a site that doesn't exist in the database, we click shorten, that generates it for us, and we can click through and go through to it. So this works perfectly now. Everything is actually working. Let's just head back to the Google example. So when we click this now, we're going through to URL shortener / and then the code. This is not useful because we haven't actually built the functionality that deals with redirecting the user. So what we need to do is inside of redirect.php build the functionality that's first of all going to grab this value and then redirect to the actual URL. That's going to pull that from the database. So we want to make use of the Shortener class. So inside of classes, this is Shortener.php. And we are first of all going to check if the code value inside of the get superglobal exists. Now you might be thinking, well, where's this coming from? Because what we're actually doing is when we are entering a URL, we're seeing this. Well, yeah, we are seeing this, but in Htaccess file, what we're going to do is we're going to use a rewrite to send something like this through to redirect.php code equals, and then the actual code. So in this case, if we chose Goog123, that will then go through to Google based on this get here. So we'll do that later after we finish this functionality. We'll make sure it works first, then we'll do the URL rewriting. But now what we want to do is instantiate a new shortener object. And we also want to store the code from the session. So this is going to be get code. And down here, we're doing the same sort of thing. We're accessing the getURL method of the shortener class or object now, but we're also then assigning the value, return value of that as a URL. So we say s get URL, and then we type in the code, so we're getting a URL from a code. If that is the case, let's echo out the URL. So the aim of this part of the class is to take this code, do a database lookup for this code. In this case, we know it exists here, and we want to return this value, and then we're going to echo it out to the page. So over to Shortener.php again, we are going to fill in the getURL method. This is fairly straightforward. There's not much to this, a few lines of code. So we're going to say the code is equal to this DB query. So we're doing a query on the database again, and we're obviously selecting the URL from the links table where the code is the code. Now we obviously need to escape this value, so let's say code equals this DB escape string code. Extremely important to make sure that that's escaped before we do it. You could of course put this down here in here, but let's keep it separate. So now that we've done that, we want to check if this has returned any values or any rows. So we say if code num rows, just to make sure that that's a positive integer. Then we want to return the URL. So we use fetch object as we did above for the method here. So we fetch the object and return the URL. But by default, we want to return an empty string in case this doesn't work. We could put an else on here, but there's not much point. So here, this should then escape code, which it will, place it into a query, returning the URL where the code matches this column. And if a value has been found, that will then return that URL to us. So now what we should see is that return the correct code. Let's test it with another one. So entering this code should return google.com. There we go, it does. So now that we've got this working, we can actually make this useful. So under redirect, we want to do a header location to index.php. No, we don't. We want to redirect to, let's double quote this so we can pull that URL found in there. So we know that we've got the URL. Let's pop that in there. And we'll also kill the page as well, and then by default we'll redirect through to index.php. This is important because if this wasn't satisfied, then we just redirect to index. So if we type a load of rubbish in here, we'll just go straight back to this page. Otherwise, we'll go through to the URL. So now that we've got this working, let's set up the htaccess file. Obviously, I'm using Apache. If you're using a different web server, this will differ, but the concept is the same. We want to take any alphanumeric string after the URL here, after this root directory where the htaccess sits, and we want to redirect this value into the redirect.php file. So let's now create the htaccess file that's going to allow us to take a value like this and then redirect it through to our redirect.php page. So I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to save this inside this directory as htaccess. Now this is going to vary depending on which web server you're using. I'm using Apache, but the concept is the same here. We want to rewrite the URL to pass an alphanumeric character through to redirect.php and make use of the code in the query string. So this isn't difficult to do. We're going to turn the rewrite engine on, and then we're going to set a rewrite rule. And the rewrite rule is going to be any alphanumeric character, so that's lowercase a to z and 0 to 9. We're only dealing with lowercase here, remember base 36. And we're going to redirect this through to redirect.php, code equals, and then the placeholder. So for example, if we use goog123 and we paste this in here, that's what it'll look like if we supply that value. So when we hit enter now, that goes through to Google. Very, very, very straightforward with URL rewriting. So let's just quickly test this out for one last time. Type in www and let's choose google.de and hit shorten. There's our shortened URL. We can check that this exists in our database, and it does indeed with a new unique code. When we click on this, we go through to Google, and you can go ahead and paste that link elsewhere and it will work in the same way. So we've built a URL shortener with PHP.